new AI was designed to predict crime. But when its most accurate data points weren't economics or arrest records, but local folklore, lunar cycles, and ghost stories, the police laughed. They called it a multi-million-dollar astrology machine. Then, the machine spit out a time, a place, and a victim for a murder that hadn't happened yet. What happens when our oldest, darkest superstitions are just data we haven't learned how to read? And what do you do when the machine starts counting down? Hashtag. Dr. Julian Croft took a steadying breath, the conditioned air of the university conference room feeling thin and sterile. He stood at the head of a long, polished table, a solitary figure against the backdrop of a massive screen. On it, the logo for his life's work, Oracle, pulsed with a soft, white light, a stylized human eye made of pure data. Its iris, a complex lattice of a neural network, seemed to watch the three men seated before him. They were the prize, the validation he'd sought for a decade, a panel of law enforcement veterans, men who had spent their lives walking beats, kicking down doors, and trusting their gut. Julian's job was to convince them to trust his numbers instead. And so, he concluded, his voice resonating with a practiced confidence that barely concealed the tremor of desperation. By cross-referencing geospatial data, hyperlocal economic indicators, and 2 decades of arrest records, Oracle can predict felony-level criminal activity with a verified 78% accuracy rate. It doesn't predict the person, gentlemen. It predicts the shadow they will cast. It finds the void, the space where a crime is statistically, almost mathematically, destined to occur. He had poured his soul, his savings, and his academic reputation into this single, elegant system. He just needed them to see what he saw. Not a black box of tricks, but the clean, beautiful, inarguable truth of mathematics. The lead panel member, a captain with a face like a roadmap of old city streets, leaned forward, his chair groaning in protest. He wasn't looking at Julian. He was squinting at a small, highlighted alert on the screen, a minor anomaly Julian had hoped they would overlook. "This one here, Doctor," the captain said, his voice a low gravel. He tapped a thick finger on the glass tabletop, pointing. "Hemlock Creek, Washington, population 912. You've got a level 4 homicide alert flagged over it." Julian's heart tightened. "A statistical outlier, certainly," he began. But the model, the captain cut him off, picking up a printout. He read from it with theatrical slowness. "Primary data drivers for this prediction are as follows." He paused, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Local folklore indices, active lunar cycles, and migratory bird patterns." A short, sharp laugh erupted from the man next to him. The captain tossed the sheet of paper onto the table, the sound echoing in the silent room. "Doctor," he said, the word dripping with condescension, "you haven't built a crime-fighting tool. You've built a multi-million-dollar astrology machine." He pushed his chair back and stood, his dismissal as absolute as a judge's gavel. "We're done here." The other 2 men followed his lead, gathering their things without making eye contact with Julian. The room, once charged with potential, was now just a sterile box filled with his failure. They filed out, leaving Julian standing alone in the deafening silence, the Oracle logo pulsing patiently behind him, a silent testament to a truth no one was willing to see. He stared at the screen, at the small, blinking alert over a town he'd never heard of, a town whose ghost stories and bird migrations had just cost him everything. Hours later, Julian sat in the driver's seat of his SUV, enveloped by the oppressive darkness of the deserted university parking lot. The only light came from his laptop on the passenger seat, its screen casting a pale, ghostly glow on his frustrated face. The Oracle interface was still running, the Hemlock Creek alert a persistent, mocking reminder of his humiliation. He'd rerun the diagnostics a dozen times, searched for a bug, a corrupted file, anything to explain the absurd variables. Nothing. The logic was sound. The math was clean. The machine was telling him that in a tiny logging town in the middle of nowhere, a ghost story was about to become a headline. His finger hovered over the trackpad, ready to shut it down, to close the lid and go home. To admit the captain was right, a sharp electronic chime cut through the silence. Julian flinched, his eyes snapping to the screen. The Hemlock Creek alert was flashing a brilliant, urgent red. The text on screen changed. The threat had escalated from level 4 to level 5. A new data packet materialized below it. Each line of text a hammer blow to his skepticism. A timer, a digital clock, counting down from 72 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds, a set of GPS coordinates, precise to 10 decimal places, pinning a location deep within the Hemlock Creek National Forest. And finally, a victim profile, algorithmically generated from public records, social media, and consumer data. Profile, female, age 25-30, residence Pacific Northwest, primary, hobby, hiking. Julian stared, his breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a vague prediction anymore. It was a testable hypothesis. It was a death warrant, written in code, with a time, a place, and a victim. All of his scientific integrity, every principle that had guided his life, screamed that a hypothesis must be tested, no matter how absurd its premise. His wounded pride warred with his cold, analytical curiosity. He could close the laptop, go home, and pretend he never saw it. Or he could drive north. He could go to Hemlock Creek and watch his life's work either die on the vine or bear its terrifying, impossible fruit. His hand moved from the trackpad to the ignition. The choice was made. The long drive north was a descent into another world. The sleek, multi-lane highways of the city bled into winding 2-lane roads, flanked by monolithic pines that swallowed the sunlight. When Julian finally rolled into Hemlock Creek, it felt less like a town and more like a temporary truce with the surrounding wilderness. The buildings were sturdy, made of dark wood and river stone, huddled together under a vast grey sky. His SUV, with its polished graphite paint and aerodynamic lines, looked like a misplaced spaceship parked in front of the sheriff's station. It sat between a Ford F-150 caked in a geology of mud and an older Bronco with a noticeable list to one side. The station itself was a log and stone building with a gently sloping roof, a plume of smoke curling from its chimney. It looked more like a hunting lodge than a hub of law enforcement. Pushing through the heavy oak door, Julian was met with the smell of old coffee and wet wool. The office was small and panelled in dark, knotted pine. A man who seemed carved from the same timber sat behind the main desk. He was huge, with a thick beard and a flannel shirt that strained at his shoulders. This had to be Sheriff Brody Evans. He looked up from his paperwork, his eyes giving Julian a slow, dismissive once-over that took in his tailored jacket and city shoes and found them wanting. At a smaller desk to the side, a young woman in a deputy's uniform looked up as well. She was Deputy Anya Sharma. Where the sheriff's gaze was a closed door, hers was one of sharp, analytical curiosity. She watched Julian with an intelligent stillness, taking in the stranger who had just stepped out of another century. "Help you with something?" Sheriff Evans grunted, his voice a low rumble. Julian stepped forward, forcing a professional calm he didn't feel. "Sheriff Evans, my name is Dr. Julian Croft. I called earlier. I'm a forensic psychologist, and I believe your town may be in imminent danger." He held out his tablet, the Oracle interface glowing in the dim office. Evans didn't take it. Julian pressed on, explaining the AI's function, the data, the high probability alert for a homicide in the next 48 hours. Sharma had stood up and moved closer, peering at the screen from behind her boss's shoulder, her brow furrowed in concentration. Evans listened with a look of weary patience, but the moment Julian got to the underlying data drivers, the sheriff's face changed. "Hold on," Evans said, finally taking the tablet. He scrolled with a thick finger. "Let me get this straight. You drove 500 miles to tell me." He squinted at the screen. "That because of folklore indices. Your computer thinks someone's going to be murdered." He leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking in protest, and let out a single, booming laugh. It wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was a laugh of dismissal, a weapon to make Julian feel small and absurd. "Sheriff, I know how it sounds," Julian said, his professionalism fraying. "But the model is 92% confident in the threat assessment. The data, however strange, has passed every diagnostic I have." Evans waved a dismissive hand. "The data? You mean the ghost stories? You telling me your robot thinks the Gloomwood Strider is going to get somebody?" He pushed the tablet back across the desk. "Son, I've got real problems. Logging disputes, a bear getting into trash cans up on Miller's Ridge. I don't have time for this nonsense." He gestured to the door. "Go on home, Doctor. Get some sleep." Behind him, Sharma's eyes were still fixed on the screen, her expression unreadable. She saw the GPS coordinates, the countdown clock, the cold, hard numbers. But she held her tongue, a subordinate unwilling to challenge the mountain that was her boss. Stone-walled and frustrated, Julian found himself walking the town's quiet main street. He couldn't leave. His own scientific method demanded he see the experiment through to its conclusion. He needed to understand the source of the data that was either a ghost in his machine or a harbinger of a genuine threat. The sign for the town library and archives was old, its paint flaking. He pushed open the door and entered a world of silence and the soft, dusty smell of aging paper. He was met not by a kindly, bespectacled librarian, but by a woman in her 60s with a severe haircut and eyes as sharp and clear as winter ice. She introduced herself as Ilara Vance, the town historian. When Julian asked for any information she had on the legend of the Gloomwood Strider, he braced himself for another laugh, another dismissal. He didn't get one. Ilara's face became a mask of grave seriousness. She didn't smile. She simply studied him for a long moment, as if assessing whether he was worthy of the knowledge he sought. "The Strider is not a story for tourists, Doctor," she said, her voice low and even. "It is not for entertainment. Some things are best left buried in the archives." The way she said it, without a hint of irony or melodrama, was more unnerving than any open hostility. She was treating the town's folklore not as a charming fiction, but as a dangerous, classified truth. Julian spent the rest of the day in a cold motel room, the countdown clock on his laptop ticking away the hours, minutes, and seconds to a murder that only he and his machine believed was coming. As night fell, a stubborn, irrational impulse drove him back to the sheriff's station. He couldn't just sit and wait. He parked across the street, watching the lights, a silent vigil for a ghost. Finally, unable to bear the inaction, he went inside and sat on a hard wooden bench in the corner, nursing a cup of burnt coffee Evans had grudgingly offered him. The sheriff was finishing paperwork, the silence in the station punctuated only by the scratch of his pen and the hum of a fluorescent light. Deputy Sharma was out on patrol. The clock on Julian's laptop screen hit Iwara 00. Nothing happened. The pen kept scratching. The light kept humming. A wave of profound, crushing relief and disappointment washed over Julian. It was a glitch. It was all a massive, career-ending glitch. Evans shot him a smug, knowing look from across the room, and then the radio on the dispatch console crackled to life, shattering the silence. "Dispatch, this is Car 2. Go ahead," Sharma's calm voice said. A man's voice, tight with panic, broke through the static. "My friend, it's Sarah. She went for a run on the Tanglewood Trail hours ago. She's not back. She's not answering her phone." The dispatcher's voice was calm, routine. "Okay, sir, stay calm. Where did she park her car?" "At the trailhead," the man said, his voice cracking. "The little gravel lot off the old logging road." The dispatcher's fingers clacked on her keyboard. "Confirming location, Tanglewood Trailhead at GPS coordinate 47.9724 north, 123.6338 west." Julian's blood ran cold. He looked down at his laptop screen. The coordinates were identical, a perfect match. Sheriff Evans froze. His pen stopped moving, hovering an inch above the form he was signing. The smug confidence drained from his face, replaced by a slack-jawed, ashen shock. Slowly, as if moving underwater, he turned his head and stared at Julian. In his eyes, was the dawning horror of a man whose solid, rational world had just cracked open, revealing a glimpse of an impossible, terrifying abyss beneath. The fragile silence in the sheriff's station had shattered into frantic, professional chaos. Within an hour, a search party was assembled, a grim procession of deputies and volunteer firefighters heading into the oppressive dark of the national forest. Julian went with them. The Oracle's coordinates a lead weight in his gut. Dawn broke cold and grey, the weak light filtering through a thick canopy of pine and mist. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. It was Deputy Sharma who found her. The missing hiker, Sarah, was lying at the base of an ancient moss-covered Douglas fir, a tree so old it looked like a feature of the landscape's geology. Julian stood with Evans and Sharma at the edge of the clearing, the yellow police tape a jarring slash of colour in the primal green and brown. As a forensic psychologist, Julian was trained to see the story left behind in the aftermath of violence, and this scene was screaming at him. The young woman's body was positioned deliberately, almost peacefully, her hands folded across her chest. It looked less like the site of a struggle and more like a sacrificial altar. The wounds were the worst part. They were deep, jagged tears, but they were clean, precise. Not the messy, frantic work of a cougar or a bear. No predator in these woods does that, Sharma said, her voice a tight whisper echoing Julian's thoughts. The bite marks are wrong, the claw patterns. It's all wrong. Sheriff Evans, however, was a man desperately trying to nail reality back into place. It was a black bear, he insisted, his voice too loud in the quiet woods. Panicked. Atypical behavior, sure, but it happens. We'll get the wildlife boys out here. They'll confirm it. But his arguments were hollow, his words a thin shield against the terrifying wrongness of the scene. He was trying to force the evidence into a box it refused to fit. He looked at Julian, his eyes filled not with animosity now, but with a desperate, unspoken plea for a rational explanation that Julian could not provide. In that moment, a tense, fragile alliance was forged in the shadow of the impossible. Evans had the badge, but Julian had the only map, however strange, to the thing that did this. His scientific mind reeling, Julian knew the only path forward was to lean into the anomaly. He went straight from the crime scene to the town archives, where Elara Vance was waiting for him. She seemed to have been expecting him. There was no "I told you so" in her expression, only a somber, intellectual focus. This time, Julian wasn't just asking questions. He was a supplicant, seeking data. "Everything," he said, his voice raw. "Everything you have on accidents, disappearances, strange sightings. Anything connected to the Gloomwood Strider legend. I need it all." Elara nodded slowly, then disappeared into the stacks. She returned not with a book or two, but with archival boxes, a forgotten history of the town's deepest fears. For hours, Julian worked, the rhythmic whir of his portable scanner the only sound in the dusty room. He scanned the brittle yellowed pages of newspaper clippings from the 1950s, detailing a tragic logging accident that claimed 6 lives. He digitized the rambling, terrified entries of a 19th century pioneer's diary, which described a shadow with hungry eyes that stalked his homestead. He fed hand-drawn maps from the 1920s into the machine, charts created by a panicked town council marking areas of ill omen in the woods. This was the midpoint, the moment of surrender. Dr. Julian Croft, the man of empirical data and hard science, was actively training his multi-million-dollar AI on a century of ghost stories, tragedies, and whispered fears. He was no longer trying to debunk the superstition. He was treating it as the most important dataset he had ever found, a qualitative record of a recurring, quantifiable horror. He was teaching his machine to believe in ghosts. That night, alone in the sterile quiet of his motel room, the work was finished. Julian watched as Oracle's progress bar hit 100%. The AI's cooling fans spun with a low hum as it cross-referenced 100 years of folklore with the precise, modern data from Sarah's murder. After a long moment, the screen blinked and a new prediction materialized. Julian's breath caught in his chest. It wasn't a single alert this time. The screen showed a map of Hemlock Creek, highlighting the town square, the epicenter of the upcoming Founders' Day festival, now only 2 days away. And across the map, in the same brilliant, terrifying red as the first alert, was a new warning. Not homicide alert. It read, mass casualty event, probability 92%. The threat had metastasized. It had grown from a single, horrifying murder into a potential massacre. The pattern, now fed with a century of tragedy, was predicting its own gruesome apotheosis. Julian didn't even stop to grab his jacket. He ran from the motel room, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, and sped toward the sheriff's station. He burst through the door to find Evans and Sharma standing over a map on the main desk. "Sheriff, the festival," Julian began, holding out his laptop. "Oracle found a new pattern, it's predicting." Evans held up a hand, cutting him off. But there was no anger in his expression. For the first time since Julian had arrived, the sheriff looked profoundly relieved, almost happy. A broad, proud smile spread across his face. "No need, Doctor," Evans said, clapping a hand on Julian's shoulder. "It's over. We got him." Julian stared, confused. "Got who?" "Our killer," Evans announced, beaming like a man who had just been vindicated by God himself. "Turns out there's a local man, a recluse, lives in a shack up in the woods not far from the trail. History of mental instability. We brought him in for questioning and found the girl's necklace in his cabin. He confessed to the whole thing. The sheriff had found his black bear after all. A simple, easy, rational scapegoat that put the world back on its axis. "The case is closed," Evans said, his voice booming with renewed confidence. "I'm holding a press conference in an hour to let the town know they're safe. The Founders' Day festival will go on as planned." He glanced at Julian's laptop screen, at the terrifying new prediction. "Looks like your machine just had a little glitch. Can't blame it. Feed a computer garbage data like ghost stories, you're bound to get garbage results." He turned away, leaving Julian standing in the middle of the room, completely and utterly alone. The town was celebrating. The monster had been caught, but Julian knew the truth. The real monster, the one born of patterns and cycles, was still out there, its shadow lengthening toward the unsuspecting festival, and he was the only one who could see it coming. The flickering light of the laptop screen cast long, dancing shadows across the cheap art on the motel room wall. On the screen, Sheriff Brody Evans stood at a podium in front of the town hall, his face a mask of solemn authority. He spoke to a small crowd of local reporters, his voice resonating with a folksy confidence that Julian now found nauseating. "I am pleased to announce," Evans said, "that the man responsible for the tragic death of Sarah Miller is in custody. This was the act of a disturbed and solitary individual, and with his arrest, the threat to Hemlock Creek is over." A reporter asked a question, her voice tinny through the laptop speakers. "Sheriff, what about the rumors of a Dr. Croft, a psychologist from the city who was helping with the case?" Evans gave a magnanimous, dismissive smile. "Dr. Croft provided some initial consultation, for which we are grateful. His computer models were an interesting, if unconventional, part of the early investigation. But in the end, this case was solved by good, old-fashioned police work." Julian slammed the laptop shut, plunging the room into near darkness. It was worse than he imagined. He wasn't just dismissed, he was a footnote, a kooky anecdote, the crazy outsider with the voodoo computer. He fell back onto the lumpy mattress, the springs groaning in protest. He had failed. His life's work was a laughingstock. His warnings were ignored, and an entire town was now happily, confidently walking into a slaughter, reassured by a lie. A profound, hollow despair settled over him. The official, scientific narrative had won, and its victory was going to be measured in bodies. He lay there for what felt like hours, adrift in a sea of failure, when a sharp knock echoed from the door. He ignored it. It came again, more insistent this time. With a weary sigh, he dragged himself to his feet and opened it. It was Ilara Vance. She wasn't there to offer condolences. Her expression was steel. She walked past him into the room and placed a heavy leather-bound book on the rickety table. It was a ledger, its cover worn smooth with age. "My grandfather was a deputy here in the 50s, she said, her voice devoid of sentiment. "He was a good man, but he was a quiet man. He saw things he couldn't talk about, so he wrote them down." She opened the ledger. The pages were filled with a steady, neat cursive, documenting the daily business of the town, but interspersed were other entries, accounts of strange disappearances, livestock mutilations, and unsolved accidents. She pointed to an entry from 1958. The year of the Big Mill fire. 7 men died. The official story was a gas leak. Her finger moved to another page, dated 1928. The year of the flash flood that washed out the old bridge. 4 families lost. "What are you showing me?" Julian asked. "The pattern," Ilara said, her gaze intense. "Doctor, you've been looking at the Gloomwood Strider as a monster, a creature. That's wrong. It's not a creature. It's a cycle. Every 30 years, something terrible happens here, a great tragedy. And every time there is a simple, rational explanation that closes the book. A fire, a flood, a lone madman. The story of the Strider isn't the cause of the violence. It's the cultural scar the violence leaves behind. It's the town's way of remembering what it's been forced to officially forget." A jolt went through Julian, a charge of adrenaline that burned away his despair. She had just handed him the Rosetta Stone. He wasn't chasing a ghost. He was tracking the echo of a recurring, covered-up massacre. That night, he sat in the corner booth of a 24-hour diner at the edge of town, the smell of stale coffee thick in the air. The bell above the door chimed, and Deputy Anya Sharma slid into the seat opposite him. She looked exhausted, her uniform rumpled. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The woodsman's confession is full of holes," she said, in a low, urgent voice. "He's terrified. He'd confess to anything right now. The necklace Evans found. It wasn't in his cabin. It was in a trash can behind his cabin. The whole thing feels too perfect, too neat, too easy." She took a deep breath, a decision solidifying in her eyes. "The sheriff is a good man, but he's terrified of anything that doesn't fit in a box. I think you're right. I think something else is going on." She slid a thin manila folder across the sticky tabletop. "This is a copy of the official case file on Sarah Miller. The autopsy report, crime scene photos, everything. Evans would have my badge if he knew." She looked him directly in the eye. "Find what he's missing, please." Back in his motel room, Julian felt a frantic, desperate energy. The room was no longer a tomb of failure. It was a command center. The ticking clock of the Founders' Day festival had been joined by the frantic thumping of his own heart. He worked with a feverish intensity, a montage of frantic progress against impending doom. He carefully scanned every page of Ilara's grandfather's logbook, converting the handwritten cursive of the past into cold, hard data. The anecdotal, folkloric record of the town's secret history poured into Oracle's memory. Then, he fed in Sharma's official file, the crisp, scientific language of the autopsy report, the high-resolution crime scene photographs, the precise measurements and chemical analyses. Hard police evidence met historical rumor. Science met superstition. On the screen, 2 disparate, warring sets of data began to merge, to cross-reference, to synthesize into a single, unified narrative of a century of darkness. He watched the AI's progress bar crawl slowly from left to right, every percentage point a victory against the clock. It was connecting a witness statement from 1958 to a soil sample from the present day. It was linking a pioneer's drawing of a strange symbol to the pattern of wounds on Sarah Miller's body. The noise was becoming a signal. The legend was being distilled into a verifiable, terrifying truth. The bar hit 99%. Julian leaned closer to the screen, his breath held tight in his chest, waiting. The progress bar on the laptop screen hit 100% and blinked once. A final, silent declaration. The synthesis was complete. Julian leaned in, his eyes scanning the lines of text that scrolled into view, the culmination of a century of secrets. The AI had found the pattern. It presented its conclusion with chilling certainty. The mass casualty event was not random. The origin point would be the old, abandoned cannery at the far edge of the festival grounds. And the profile of the unsub was no longer a vague shadow. It was a collective. Not one killer, but a group, acting in concert, bound by a shared generational ideology. The Founders' Day festival was in full, joyous swing. The air, thick with the smell of popcorn and grilled onions, carried the sounds of cheerful music and the laughter of children. Families milled about the town square, their faces bright with a relief so profound it was almost tangible. The monster had been caught. They were safe. Sheriff Evans and his deputies moved through the crowd with a lazy, relaxed gait, smiling and shaking hands. Julian and Deputy Sharma moved against the current of the happy crowd, two salmon swimming upstream against a tide of blissful ignorance. On his tablet, Julian showed her the final horrifying prediction. Her face, already tense, hardened into a mask of grim resolve. They were ghosts at the feast, the sole attendees of a funeral no one else knew was happening. Their path took them away from the bright lights and music, toward the derelict skeletal frame of the cannery that loomed at the edge of the woods like a forgotten headstone. Inside, the air was cold and still, heavy with the metallic scent of rust and decay. Sunlight struggled through grimy, broken windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the dead air. It took them only a few minutes to find it, a makeshift command center set up in what was once a foreman's office. Maps of the festival grounds were spread across a table, marked with precise hand-drawn routes for crowd flow and potential kill zones. And in the corner, a horrifying discovery. Several large industrial chemical containers connected by a network of wires to a series of timers and igniters. The plan was diabolically simple. A fire, or perhaps the release of a noxious chemical, would be triggered at the peak of the festival. The ensuing panic would not be random. It would be a controlled stampede, a human river channeled by the festival's layout directly into the ambush points they had seen marked on the maps. They weren't just planning to kill, they were planning to harvest. "My God!" Sharma breathed, her hand resting on the grip of her pistol. Oracle was right. This is a slaughter. "They've done this before," Julian said, his voice a low, horrified whisper. "This is a methodology, refined over generations." A voice from the shadows behind them made them both freeze. Refined, yes, and perfected. They turned to see three figures emerge from the darkness of the cavernous main floor. They were a man and two women, dressed in simple, practical work clothes, their faces eerily calm. They looked like any other family from Hemlock Creek, but their eyes held a chilling, fanatical light. The man, clearly the leader, offered a polite, almost pleasant smile. "It is a sacred duty," he explained, as if discussing the weather. "Our family founded this town. We built it from the wilderness, and it is our responsibility to maintain its health. Every 30 years, the flock must be pruned of the weak, the complacent. It is a necessary sacrifice to keep the town pure, to keep the soul of Hemlock Creek strong." "The Gloomwood Strider," Julian stated, the final piece clicking into place. "You created the legend." The man nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "The perfect shepherd for the flock. A story to explain the unexplainable. It allows the town to heal, to forget the specifics, but to remember the lesson on a deeper, primal level. We are not murderers, Doctor. We are gardeners." The gardeners moved, not with frantic anger, but with a calm, methodical purpose. The fight was brutal and immediate. Sharma was a professional, well-trained and fast, but she was outnumbered. Julian, a man of intellect, not action, felt a surge of useless adrenaline, but in his hand was his phone, its screen glowing, connected to Oracle. As one of the women lunged at Sharma from the side, Julian's eyes caught the data streaming on his screen. "To your left, Anya! 91% probability of a distracting attack," he yelled. Sharma spun, parrying the blow just in time. The man scrambled up a rusting catwalk. "He's retreating to high ground. 72% chance," Julian shouted. Sharma didn't hesitate. She fired a round into the railing in front of the man, forcing him back down. The AI, fed with the killer's generational patterns and psychological profiles, was predicting their moves a fraction of a second before they made them. Julian was no longer just an observer. He was a weapon, his mind and his machine, an extension of Sharma's will to survive. It was a brutal, chaotic dance of violence and probability, and against all odds, they were winning. Night had fallen. The festival was a ghost town, its cheerful lights now illuminating a scene of quiet, controlled emergency. Flashing red and blue lights painted the faces of the townspeople, who stood in huddled, silent groups, their joyful relief from hours earlier replaced by a creeping, horrified understanding. Julian sat on the bumper of an ambulance, a coarse blanket draped over his shoulders. He watched as the three killers, now in handcuffs, were led to a patrol car, their fanatical calm finally broken, replaced by a sullen, bitter defeat. A figure approached through the flashing lights. It was Sheriff Evans. He looked older, humbled, the arrogant certainty completely stripped away. He stood before Julian for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. "I called off the press conference," Evans said, his voice low and raspy. He looked at the captured family, then back at Julian. "They found things in their cellar, journals, trophies, going back generations." He shook his head, a man grappling with a truth too monstrous to fully comprehend. He looked at Julian, his eyes finally holding a measure of respect. "I don't know what that thing of yours is," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Julian's pocket, where the phone with the Oracle app was dark. "I don't know how it knew, but thank you." It was more than an apology. It was a concession. A white flag from a man of a simple, orderly world, offered to a man who had proven that the world was anything but. Julian nodded, too exhausted to speak. He looked out at the lights, at the town that was saved not by debunking its deepest fears, but by finally, terrifyingly, listening to them. What is the line between a data point and a ghost story? It's a question that sits at the very heart of the story we just heard. We're conditioned to trust what we can measure, to put our faith in the clean, cold logic of numbers and evidence. Anything else, a local legend, a town's whispered fears, a generational superstition, we dismiss as noise, as the irrational chatter of a pre-scientific world. But what's so fascinating about Julian Croft's journey is how it forces us to reconsider the nature of information itself. The story cleverly reframes folklore not as a supernatural belief, but as a kind of cultural scar, an unconventional data set, written in a language of trauma and memory that records a truth the official history tried to bury. The AI, Oracle, was the only one who could read it, because it had no human bias to dismiss it as nonsense. It just saw a pattern, and the ultimate revelation is the most chilling part. The monster wasn't the legend. The real horror was a deeply human tradition, a cold and methodical cycle of violence that had learned to wrap itself in the convenient disguise of superstition. The ghost story was just a cover for a very real, very calculated evil. It makes you wonder, what patterns might be hiding in the stories we dismiss as just folklore?